Everyone loves a good movie. Whether it's the edge-of-your-seat action, blood-curdling horror, or cheesy romance, a movie is always a fun way to escape reality for a little while. However, the line between fact and fiction isn't as clear as you might think, and reality is often much stranger than fiction. In this video, I'll show you 10 movies that you never knew were based off real events. Number 10. Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a series of movies based on the books by J.R.R. Tolkien. They center on a mythical universe at war over a magic ring that bestows incredible power on the wearer. Now, I'm not saying that Middle-earth, orcs, dragons, or elves are real, but over 1,000 years ago in ancient Britain, a Roman called Silvianus owned a large precious gold ring that ended up getting stolen by a man called Sinicianus. Silvianus cursed Sinicianus by writing stone onto a tablet. Among those named, Sinicianus permit no good health until it is returned to the Temple of Nodens. Fast forward about 1,000 years, and Tolkien was working as a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University, and he had been hired to find out who Nodens was. Then, as Tolkien researched deeper and deeper, the idea of a cursed ring began to expand in his mind into the Lord of the Rings universe. But the ring isn't the only historical influence on Tolkien's writing. Many have said he used the Siege of Vienna in 1529 as inspiration for the Battle of Pelennor in his third book, Return of the King. Others have claimed that the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy is an allegory for World War II, which was raging while he was working on the book, with the plucky hobbits representing Britain and evil Sauron being Hitler, of course. Number 9. The Terminal. In the 2004 movie The Terminal, Tom Hanks plays an Eastern European man who travels to New York, only to discover that because of a war that's currently waging, he is not allowed to enter or exit the USA, leaving him stuck indefinitely at JFK Airport. The real story is slightly different and even more unbelievable than the movie. In reality, our protagonist wasn't Eastern European, but Iranian. His name was Mehran Karimi Nasiriyah. He came to the UK to study, but on a visit back home, he was arrested and expelled from Iran because of his political activism. He flew to Paris, where he got robbed outside the airport, losing all his documents in the process. When he got to London, they sent him back to Paris, and without his documents, he couldn't leave, and ended up trapped in Charles de Gaulle Airport for 15 years. He was adopted by the airport and was offered food and meal vouchers by airport personnel. His stay at the airport ended when he was hospitalized, after which he eventually went to live in a Paris shelter. Number 8. The Blob. The first horror film in this list is The Blob, a real classic. The plot follows a weird alien blob that eats everything it touches, getting bigger in the process. Unsurprisingly, this wasn't based on a real extraterrestrial monster, but on a rumor of one from way back in the 1950s. In Philadelphia, patrol cops Joe Keegan and John Collins claimed to have seen something fall to the earth. When they went to investigate, they found a strange purple, pulsating, 6-foot in diameter mass of something. Not knowing what it was, they called for backup. When Sergeant Joe Cook came on the scene and picked some up, it broke apart and quickly evaporated into odorless scum. It only took 30 minutes for the entire blob to completely evaporate, leaving no evidence except the testimony of 3 confused cops. For this reason, it's impossible to tell just how true this story is. But when the Blob writers Kay Lineker and Theodore Thompson read about the story in the local paper, they knew they found the inspiration for their next movie. Number 7. 300. If there's one thing that can be said about the 2006 hash and slack classic 300, it would be, this is exaggerated. The movie is based on a comic book series from 1998, which, unlike a lot of similar movies, was actually praised for staying true to the source material. The comic book was based on an earlier film, 300 Spartans, which itself was a dramatization of a real-life event, the Battle of Thermopylae, waged between the Greek state of Sparta and the much larger nation of Persia in 480 BC. Fair to say the numbers were not on the Spartan side, but they did put up a good fight. In reality, the 300 Spartans were closer to 7,000, and the 1 million Persians were more like 100,000. The film, like the comic book, which was part funded by Greek government, has been accused of having crude political undertones that makes the more Middle Eastern Persians out to be the villains, while the more European Greeks and Spartans save the day against all odds. But in real life, the picture was more complicated. The Spartans had a very violent militaristic culture, whilst the Persians were world famous for their culture and religious tolerance. Still a totally epic tale and story, I must admit. Number 6. The Conjuring. One of the most successful horror franchises of the modern era is The Conjuring. If you've just put on a clean pair of underwear, you might want to skip this one. The Conjuring is a series of films about demons and malign spirits wreaking havoc. And in the first 2 films, it features demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, who use their paranormal investigation techniques to put an end to the hauntings. Well, Ed and Lorraine Warren were real people who really did hunt demons for a living. Or at least that's what they claim they did. The Conjuring is primarily based on an investigation by the Warrens into a haunted doll that was supposedly possessed by a girl named Annabelle Higgins. The Annabelle doll is also real, and you can actually visit it at the Warrens Family Museum of the Occult. It was allegedly put there after its previous owner complained of paranormal goings-on. Some have labeled Ed and Lorraine Warren as frauds, charlatans, making a quick buck from other people's tragic life experiences. And if the alternative is violent and pervasive demons, I hope those critics are right. Number 5. The Revenant. The first movie that Leonardo DiCaprio won an Oscar for, The Revenant, is a thrilling survival story set in the old frontier USA. When Hugh Glass has his son killed and left for dead, it's up to him to get back to civilization. But what you might not know is that Hugh Glass was a real person. He was left in the icy wilderness by his hunting team, and really was mauled by a bear. But he survived and made it back to civilization. Now that'd be an impressive story nowadays, but in the 1700s, it's something else. Despite being based on a true story, there are a few elements of fiction sprinkled in there. For example, it's unknown whether or not Glass fell for a Pawnee woman, and the whole vengeance part and ending was entirely made up for the film. It also portrays French-Canadian explorers in a very negative light, whereas in reality, it was the Americans who actually behaved much worse. But even if certain elements had been adjusted ever so slightly, it's still an inspirational tale of survival, self-belief, and determination. Number 4. Catch Me If You Can. When you think of a con man, you might think of some lonely weirdo sending millions of spam emails every day, but the 2002 movie Catch Me If You Can makes con artistry look cool. Frank Abagnale, the main character, was actually a real person who forged checks so convincingly that even the banks couldn't tell they were fakes. As with his fictional counterpart, Abagnale enjoyed a game of dress-up, creating multiple totally fake personas that he used for financial gain. His impeccable dress sense made him more convincing when he went to cash the forged checks, and he enjoyed many perks of his life as an imposter, like free luxury hotel stays and gourmet meals. One of his fake personas was that of an airline pilot, although he could actually fly planes. On other occasions, he impersonated a doctor, but he quit that when he realized that this particular scheme was putting lives at risk. All in all, he had 8 different identities, and claimed to have escaped police custody twice, before being hired by the FBI as a consultant. His colorful life story became the subject of a book, and then the film, in which Leonardo DiCaprio plays Abagnale, and Tom Hanks is the FBI agent assigned to catch him. Number 3. Rain Man. The 1988 flick Rain Man is a heartwarming comedy about a car dealer named Charlie Babbitt who tracks down his long-lost autistic brother Raymond and takes him on a road trip. Raymond stands to inherit their father's huge estate, but his mental state complicates matters. Whilst Raymond suffers from social difficulties, he has an exceptional memory and ability to compute numbers. Overall, Rain Man is surprisingly accurate to the real-life story, although Raymond was actually called Kim Peek. In order to make the movie as accurate as it could possibly be, Dustin Hoffman, who played Raymond, met with Peek to get a proper idea of what it was like to have a day in his life, and to play the most accurate version that he could. Unlike a few other movies on this list, I'm actually glad this story is true. It's a sweet tale about friendship and brotherhood, and has been the subject of several documentaries by the BBC and Discovery Channel. Number 2. Indiana Jones. When you think of fiction's great explorers, who comes to mind? Indiana Jones has got to be pretty high up on that list. Jones was supposedly based on a real-life American academic and treasure hunter called Roy Chapman Andrews. Andrews began exploring in 1908 when the museum he worked at invited him to go whaling. Similar to Indiana Jones, Andrews had a few dances with death, narrowly surviving typhoons, having his boat charged by a whale, being attacked by wild dogs, angry Tibetan priests, pythons, and bandits. And it was Andrew who discovered the first dinosaur eggs. He found them in a typical Maverick Indiana Jones style. While his colleagues were excavating a paleontological site with delicate brushes, he decided to use a pickaxe instead, and quickly uncovered the fossilized eggs with a swift strike from his axe. If he hadn't done this, the eggs wouldn't have been discovered, as they were considerably deeper than expected. The discovery taught us a lot about dinosaurs and their physiology, specifically how they bred and procreated. All 25 of the eggs were brought back to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. On one occasion, he was traveling down a mountainside when he saw some bandits at the bottom. Not wanting to give up his loot, Andrew and his team went straight into them at high speed, despite their opponents being heavily armed with rifles. This startled the bandits' horses, who ran off. The only one brave enough to stay ran away too when Andrew shot off his hat. Indiana Jones, eat your heart out. Number 1. Nightmare on Elm Street. In at number 1 is one of the greatest horror franchises ever made, Nightmare on Elm Street. Yes, it's true. Freddy Krueger is real. Even his name was taken from an older kid who used to bully director Wes Craven at school. Well, tell a lie. Freddy Krueger never existed, but he was based off a string of disturbing real-life events. During the Vietnam War, many refugees fled to the USA in order to get away from the killings and seemingly endless bombings. In a tragic twist, even once they fled the war zone, they weren't safe. During the late 70s and early 80s, there were multiple reports of these refugees passing away in their sleep after suffering from horrendous nightmares and psychological anguish. Most likely, these mysterious deaths were a result of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, resulting from their terrible experiences. PTSD made them fear nightmares so much that they were unable to sleep, eventually killing them from exhaustion. However horrible fiction can be sometimes, the real stories behind them are just as nasty. This phenomenon is sometimes called sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, and whilst it could technically happen to anyone, these Vietnamese refugees were among the most well-known victims. So which of these real-life movies do you find the most surprising? Have you ever heard of any other stranger-than-fiction stories that Hollywood needs to hear about? Let me know in the comments down below, and thanks for watching.